So good morning again. I'm Bill McNeese, president of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology. I thank you so much for joining us today for the Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture. We're looking forward to that and some other items too. So we'll get underway with this busy session here. And the first item of business is presentation of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology Distinguished Service Award. Our presenter for this is Dr. Catherine McGoldrick. She is chair of the WLM DSA committee, former president of the WLM, and a recipient of the 2017 WLM Distinguished Service Award. So we invite her to the podium to introduce this year's recipient.
Thank you, Dr. McNeese. For 32 years, Dr. George Baus has served as honorary curator of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology, a role that has involved hand-carrying or otherwise transporting rare books and extremely expensive anesthesia techniques from all 7 continents of the world. Many of these priceless items that George has collected for the WLM have been featured in the 11 years of reflections that George has authored for the journal Anesthesiology. Time constraints do not permit me to do justice to George's illustrious career. However, suffice it to say that George has written hundreds of articles, mentored countless anesthesiology residents, and delivered several eponymous lectures. In fact, he's delivered not 1 but 2 Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lectures. In addition, in 2016, George was named the WLM Laureate of the History of Anesthesia, an international honor bestowed for his many contributions to advancing knowledge of the history of anesthesiology. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to present the 2019 WLM Distinguished Service Award to Dr. George Baus, who for more than 3 decades has unselfishly given of his time, treasure, and talent to the Wood Library.
Thanks very much. Truly a well-deserved award. Next up on our morning agenda is the Wood Library Museum Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture. To introduce our speaker for this morning is Susan Vassallo. Dr. Vassallo is chair of the WLM Lewis H. Wright Lecture Committee. She is a past president of the Wood Library Museum. We invite her to the podium. And I will remind you of one thing. After today's Lewis Wright lecture, there'll be a presentation of the award for that. And immediately after that will be the announcement of the 2020 laureate. So please stay tuned at the end of the lecture for another announcement.
Thank you, Bill. Can we pull up the opening slide, please? Thank you. Which should be here. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And let's make sure we see. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for coming. The Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture is sponsored annually by the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology and honors its namesake, who is a pioneer in American anesthesiology. Dr. Wright was committed to advancing the status of anesthesiology as an advanced medical science and as a specialty in its own right. Dr. Wright served as a founding member of the Board of Trustees and as President Emeritus. In 1973, the New York State Society of Anesthesiologists endowed this lectureship to honor Dr. Wright, who died the following year. This year's speaker is Warren M. Zapol, MD, the Reginald Jenney Distinguished Professor of Anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School and Anesthetist in Chief Emeritus at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Zapol graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of Rochester School of Medicine, and the MGH Anesthesia Residency. Dr. Zapol's primary research focus has been in the treatment of acute respiratory failure in animals and in humans. In 1970, Dr. Zapol was at the NIH when he and his mentor were part of a team to study Ecmo, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, in the treatment of hypoxic newborn infants. Then, supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, he led 9 expeditions to the Antarctic, where his team studied the diving adaptations and mechanisms of Weddell seals. Specifically, his research led his team to understand how seals avoid decompression sickness, or the bends, and hypoxia. When he returned to the MGH, he completed his anesthesia residency. In 1990, his team began the first clinical trials of inhaled nitric oxide, or NO, in the treatment of hypoxic newborns who also had primary pulmonary hypertension. His research from the animals led him to, from the Weddell seals, led him to perfect this technique, and NO has saved thousands of lives of babies. In 2006, a steep Antarctic glacier was named for him. Now his team is looking at novel methods of generating nitric oxide, specifically electric nitric oxide. On behalf of the Wood Library Museum of Anesthesiology, we thank you for your commitment to basic research and clinical care within the operating room and in the critical care units. You've been an inspiration to a generation of physicians and scientists. With much gratitude, thank you. All right.
Let's have some fun. I will take you around the world, and you'll understand why I did it. I'll try and make it understandable. That'll be the most fun. And I'll even try and make this work. Go forward. There you go. Yeah. So we'll start talking about seals, because Susan asked me to talk about seals. First, I thank the Wood Library of Medicine for inviting me, Susan Vassallo in particular, who knows me quite well, for putting me up to this. So we start in Antarctica. Why did I go to Antarctica? I'm an anesthesia resident. And somebody says, you know, there are these seals, they can hold their breath for 90 minutes pregnant. Really? They just breath hold? Yeah, and they can dive to 500-600 meters. Now, every 10 meters under the ocean is an atmosphere, so it's only 50 or 60 atmospheres they're compressing to. How do they do it? Wouldn't it be nice if my patients could hold their breath for 90 minutes when I want to intubate them? Maybe I can figure this out. Maybe there's something transferable here. So that's what I went after. And in a nutshell, first we studied them in the lab. These are 1,000-pound seals, 9 feet long seals. You know, you have to kind of learn and how to deal with them. And then somebody at Woods Hole published, there's no such thing as the diving reflex in science. I said, bullshit, of course there's a diving reflex. Put your face in ice water someday and watch your heart rate fall. So clearly there is a diving reflex. And so things got to be things, and I convinced a very bright young engineer to build little microcomputers. This is 1985 when I did it. And so we had probably less memory than your phone, or far less than your phone, less than your iWatch probably, and about 60K of memory, very, very little. So we built computers ourselves. In 1985, there were no Apples. You had to do your own thing. And we worked on something called a fish hut. So we drilled a hole in the ice. The ice is 6 foot thick in Antarctica. We got the Navy to drill a hole. You gave them a bottle of scotch, and they would drill a hole for you. And sometimes they drilled 2 holes for you. We're about 30 miles offshore, and we put a little house over one hole. And we teach the seal to come back to that hole. So he's very happy. He's a young male. And he goes and he dives, and he finds fish at 200, 250 meters. And he comes back, and I'm the only hole to breathe at. That's why we're so far out on the ice sheet. But he's got a private fishing hole, so he's very happy. And he comes back. He's got a computer on his back, and as you can see, we can hook the computer up to the house computer, say, what was the heart rate? What was the velocity? What was the depth? Now I want you to draw a blood sample. We had an A line. I want you to draw a blood sample at 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. Do the same at 50 on the way back. So we had to seal serial blood gas measurements due to a little computer that was glued to its back. Science, right? That's where you end up with stuff like that. That's Roger Hill, an English physicist. There's a seal next to him. You can see there's a flush bag. Now remember, this is not your hospital. This is the Antarctic Ocean, and it's -2 Celsius. So it's going to freeze if you put an IV bottle in that water or bag. So it's got antifreeze in it. And then there's a roller pump, which is driven by my computer, which says, draw a sample now, draw a sample now. And then you, on each return, you say 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. And then we had a porcupine, so we could get up to about 6 samples on every dive. And there's a radio transmitter on his tail, just in case he decides to disappear, and we have to go look for him with a helicopter. So that's a seal. There's someone holding a board. They're rather like dogs. They're rather friendly, the Weddell seal. If you have to pick a seal to study, go for the Weddell. And this is a little movie, and maybe it'll play. I'll click again. Click. Come on. Come on, movie, play.
When the seal was fully dressed, we had in principle 2 options: to release it via the breathing hole in the lab or via our second emergency breathing hole located a short distance from the lab. We found that the latter, involving taking the seal for a short breezy walk in these brisk Antarctic winds, worked best.
There he goes! Yay! The seal show's on the road! Got it just on the script, wasn't he? Was the little pump flushing too? The little pump was flushing. The little pump flashing too. It was. Little flushing stuff. Every 30 seconds or something before we went to the hole.
Well, you get the idea. It was a good group. A lot of people helped me. Roger Hill, Bob Schneider, many, many others, many anesthesiologists over the years, Bill Herford, many others. And we basically collected a lot of diving information on free diving seals. He went off when he wanted to, he came back when he wanted to, and we could measure every gas, every metabolite. We had a great Canadian biochemist, Peter Hochachka, who wrote just everything about the biochemistry of these critters.
When the seal was
So that's what they look like. It's a fiber optic line coming off the computer with a little cork in the end of it, so it would float up. So you could, when he's sitting in the hole, sometimes he'd bring you back a fish or half fish, make sure we were happy, and then hook up that little cork and hook it up to the house computer, dump the memory, reprogram the memory. But you had to build it, and it had to be good for 20, 30 atmospheres of pressure. So the Navy went crazy when they saw this stuff. Obviously, they were thinking, could we build drones? Could we build things? Could we use SEALs? And this is just a simple proof of the fact that SEALs do have, let's see, there it is, do have a diving reflex. This is a depth in red, and that's a 250-meter, 25-atmosphere dive. He goes down there, catches a fish. I know because in his plasma he has lipid now. All the Antarctic fishes are lipidy. And then he comes back. And look at his heart rate. He starts at around 80, 90, and boom, down to 20, and then down to 10. Can you imagine having a heart rate at 10? Boom. Wait 10 seconds. Boom. Amazing. So they're remarkable creatures. And then eats his fish and turns over and looks up and sees our nice hole in the Antarctic ocean, ice. And he lets his heart rate up a little bit, but he doesn't let his heart rate up until he hits the surface, when he goes, and then he lets his heart rate up. And then it slowly comes down as he sits in the hole and digests his fish. There is a diving reflex. It is very profound in Weddell seals. There is this constriction, peripheral vasoconstriction, and are basically making all the blood flow go to the brain, heart. That's about it. That's all you need when you're diving. And the rest of the stuff you can perfuse later. Interesting stuff. And this is just PO2. I'd love to ask you, why do you think the PO2 of a seal breathing air is 230? Because it's only 150 in the atmosphere. How could that be? Well, think about it. As the seal swims down, and the pressure squeezes his thorax and his alveolar pressure rises. And it gets up to about 230 or something like that. And then he begins consuming, and boom, the PO2 falls. And you can see both short dives, less than 17 minutes, and long dives, the PO2 is down around 25. So burn it off while you can. And he knows when he's coming back, he can see the hole. He knows how far he'll go. But even on long dives, I think the longest is 10 or 12, something like that. And their P50 looks just like yours. The seal doesn't have a P50 shift. Interesting stuff. Yes, I'll close the Antarctic story. My daughter called me one day and said, "Dad, Google Zapol and glacier." And you can, and there it is. I didn't know. They never tell you when you get a glacier or a mountain or anything. You just find out. You know, you open the book, there you are. And people are always worried that it's going to melt in global warming. But if this glacier melts, you'll be living in the Rockies. Let me tell you why, because this is the highest mountain in Antarctica at 17,000 feet. It's Mount Vinson. A lot of people like to climb the highest mountain on every continent. And this is my glacier. And it's crevasse, so be careful if you go across it. But they say it's the best descent slope. So you'll read as mountaineers tend to cross it. But these are really bad places. They can be snowed on, and you can easily fall through. So be careful if you go to the Zapol Glacier, is all I can say. I don't think I'll ever go. Okay, a few words on Ecmo, which at the MGH, I think they're doing 100 of them this year, 110 in that. So the world has changed since I was a little boy. So I started working with a genius at NIH. It was during the Vietnam War, and I was one of the so-called yellow berets. we'd go to NIH instead, and we could be in the public health service for a couple of years. And there were a bunch of us there. And I was lucky. I worked with a fellow by the name of Ted Colombo, and he designed catheters and membrane lungs and artificial kidneys and artificial heart squeezers. So he did everything. And I said, Ted, you got to focus down here now. Just work on one of these things. But he never did. And what I worked on, I was interested in growing babies outside their mothers, artificial placenta. And it ended up in Science, and it's a good story. Here's a sheep fetus, which we cannulated, and here are Colombo's membrane lungs, these tubular structures. He developed the first disposable membrane lung, and he was amazing. He was about 30 years ahead of the rest of us. I remember him coming to me at MGH and saying, remember, Warren, ventilators kill. Oh, that was pretty, why? And of course, he was right. And it took till 2000 for us to prove that high-pressure ventilation destroyed the lung, and you had to use low-pressure ventilation. But he was way ahead. He really understood. He was a genius, and we just had his memorial ceremony at NIH. And as usual, I end up in the papers. This was the New York Times, and everybody got a kick out of the idea that you could grow babies with umbilical cannulation outside of their mother. We were only going, at this point, up to 2 days. We actually got up to a week. This is in the early days when we didn't know how much heparin to use. We didn't use very good membrane lungs, but we did our best. I'm sure it will happen. It will happen for your grandchildren and their grandchildren. They will be grown outside of mom when necessary. And so I went back to MGH after did my residency. Dick Kitts was very kind to me and said he'd help me, and I thought he was the best chief I ever had. And this is what I built, these devices. This is the first Ecmo machine at MGH. It's a 5 square meter membrane lung, gravity drainage. This is a 17-year-old girl, the daughter of a famous country music singer, sent to me from Vanderbilt, and I bypassed her for a month. It's tough. Not many of our patients survived in that era. I think the first survivor was like 72, Don Hill, someone who jumped off the San Francisco Bay Bridge, New England Journal. But there were very few. It was, and I can tell you all the reasons why. We didn't know how to perfuse. We used to do VV. We did VA, like cardiac surgeons, and in the end, we ended up doing VV because we didn't want to reduce pulmonary blood flow because the lung clotted off and died. And so that was the first mistake. The second mistake, it just took us 30 years to figure this out. Don't worry, time goes by. The second was we didn't have good membrane lungs. We had silicone rubber. It was thrombotic, and it had diffusive impedance. And what we've gone to now, what people use every day in cardiac surgery is a microporous polymethylpentene, which is much better. And I'll show you another lung I developed in my last slide, it's brand new, and which is neat. Less anticoagulation. I think they went 5 liters a day in blood transfusion for the first patients we did. We didn't understand that you needed very little anticoagulation or heparin. And then finally, this thing of, there were people doing something called super Peep in those days. They used to use Civetta used 30 centimeters of water, Peep, and it just tore the hell out of the lung, obviously. So you had an injured lung and you were blowing it up, and only the better parts of the lung got the big pressure, so it's not a good idea. It's another world. That's what it looks like now, today, at Mass General. You have people awake, on bypass. They do very well. It's another world. We're doing 110 a year, usually for cardiac assistance after various cardiac operations. And then I have to show all the, that was my teacher, that's I. That's Bob Bartlett, who first did babies, well, second after a fellow named Wright. And he pushed the baby use of Ecmo and kept it alive, and that's why we do baby Ecmo. That's Bartlett. And then here's Gattinoni, the guy who pushed veno-venous perfusion, and Pacenti, who has now got his job in Milan. He was chief in Milan. And there are lots of Italians here, many of whom I don't know their name. But this is Milan, 2008. Well, I'm working on Ecmo, I'm working on ventilation, and I'm in OR 8 with Hermes Grillo, and a phone rings off the wall. And I say, well, who is it? Who's calling me in the OR? And they said, Dr. Zapol, this is Russia on the phone. I said, oh, my friends, huh? Yeah, and so they said, yeah, there's a very sick young lady, and could you help us, advise us? I talked to them about using low levels of Peep. What antibiotic are they on? Blah, 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 blah. Long story. And finally, they call back the next day, and they say, she's no better. We want you to come. I said, I don't have a passport. I don't have a visa. I don't have anything. They said, don't worry. Come Aeroflot. So 2 minutes later, the State Department calls me on the phone and said, don't go. Don't go. We'll get your papers, but don't go, because they're going to put you right in jail in Sheremetyevo. You're never going to get any further. I said, do I believe these people, or do I believe the Russians? I said, I probably believe the Russians. So I go to New York, and the Russians come with all their stamps and machines and papers, and they give them to me, and I bring a ventilator, and I bring, as I go out the door, I ask the chief of antibiotics, I said, what antibiotic should I bring? I think she's probably got sepsis. And they said, BBK8. I said, okay, it's an experimental drug. He said, yeah. And so he gave me a load of BBK8, something known as amikacin now. But at that time, it was BBK8. And so I took BBK8, and I went to Moscow. And I ended up spending a month or two taking care of this young lady, Marina Burakovskaya. And that was back when we put IVs in bottles, so it gives you an idea how ancient it is. And that is an MGH ventilator, which I then paid them back for. And I had it, they didn't have air. So I got an air compressor. And anyway, took care of Marina for days and days. And there's stories inside stories here. And then finally, I think one of the best ones was I went with Borakovsky, and I learned toast carefully with vodka. It is very potent, is all I can say. So this is Borakovsky, her father, who was the best cardiac surgeon in Russia. And he had done Soslav's grandchild. He's done everybody. And all I can remember is one night, which was really great, at Borakovsky's, there was a birthday party for me. It was my birthday. And Primakov, who becomes the premier of the Soviet Union, and all these people are there because she was getting better. So they liked that. They were kind to me. They were good to me. They gave me all kinds of presents and Arbatov, who was head of the Institute of the United States of America and Canada, says, Zapol, I sit with the generals, and when the generals want to push the button, I tell them, you came here to save the life of a young Russian girl. And my hair stood up when he said, the generals want to push the button. Can you imagine that? It was awful. It was awful. Anyway, it was great. It all happened. It all worked. And blah, blah. She did well. She's still alive. She's living down in the Canaries now. Has a daughter and a granddaughter, and we've been back for the family. And even the Russians did Radi Zhizny. You learn a little Russian when you're there. And the Russians didn't believe their newspapers very much. But if it was near the weather, they believed it. So this article was right next to the weather, because you know the weather is okay. So they printed the stuff you should believe right next to the weather. Okay. Well, I'm working along. It's 89, 88, 89. Somebody wants me to go to UCLA. My wife, Nikki, is wise enough to tell me, don't go, stay home. Your daughter needs an agent if she goes there. No, we're not going to go to LA. And I meet a guy who's trying to recruit me there, whose name is Lou Ignaro, who was the man who figured out that endothelial-derived relaxing factor was nitric oxide, a gas. Good stuff. And what I'm doing at MGH is Ecmo. So there's a baby at MGH, and it's perfused through this long tubular structure. About 15% of them bleed into their heads, and pediatricians hate Ecmo. And then along come these guys. This is a bit later, and this is Lou in the middle. And I say to Lou, nitric oxide, that's a gas. Can I breathe it? He says, no, it'll kill you. I said, really, Lou? Yeah, don't breathe it. It's poisonous. And then I buy the LA Times. You ever open the LA Times and look on the breathing page? You know what you breathe in LA? Ozone, NO2, and my eyes stopped on NO2 because I know nothing makes NO2. It makes NO, and then in the air, it oxidizes to NO2. But cars and buses and airplanes make NO, carbon monoxide and particles. And I'm thinking, well, maybe you can just breathe this stuff, despite what Lou tells me. Maybe, like most things in medicine, it's the dose that counts. So I called the Environmental Protection Agency in North Carolina, wherever they live, and I said, can I breathe NO? And they said, sure, just look it up. You can breathe up to, I think, 25 ppm, parts per million. A million per million is pure gas, 25 ppm. You can breathe it for 8 hours a day. If you work at McDonald's, back in those days before microwaves, McDonald's used to have fires and, cooking fires, and they had NO. And they made NO and NO2, and okay. So I was thinking 25. So I went home, I got a sheep, my favorite animal. They don't bite, they don't bark. They're terrific to work with. And I got sheep, and I said to myself, well, maybe, how about having a dream? The dream is if you breathe NO, it will diffuse across to the vessels in your lung, hit the guanylate cyclase, and make cyclic GMP, which will relax the smooth muscle, lower the pulmonary hypertension. So I've been giving these things IV, nitroglycerin, nitroprusside, but I said, boy, those are awful because they lower the blood pressure. We could do it without lowering the blood pressure this way. Why? Because the NO would be destroyed. It would bind instantaneously to hemoglobin and then come out as nitrate and nitrite. And so it would not be a systemic vasodilator. If you breathe it, it would only be a pulmonary vasodilator. Bingo. We're there. It worked. We did sheep. You opened the windows, I remember in the lab. Dave Poliner, who isn't here today right at the moment, but who I saw last night, and I and a few other people did this. We opened the windows in the lab. We all wore gas masks. We gave the NO to the sheep. We tightened his pulmonary circulation up with U46619, a prostaglandin, and a peroxide, and then we showed very clearly that we could drop the PA pressure, but it didn't change the systemic arterial pressure. Bingo, we had it. Did a dozen sheep, published the sheep paper, and then Jay Roberts and I, a neonatologist anesthesiologist, he'd been our chief resident, we started to convince people to let us do their babies. And here's a baby. I think it was number 3. And it had a blood pressure of about 30 or 35 and a PO2 of 30 or 35. And we could give it 20, 40, 80 parts per million, and you could see the PO2 of the baby came up, and the blood pressure didn't change. Everybody who tried other vasodilators had killed the babies pretty often because it dilated the systemic circulation. Anyway, we did a dozen babies. We published that Denver had followed my sheep work, and they had done some, Steve Abman and the people out there. And anyway, it became real. And you can see what happened here. This is where we did our first baby. This is where we published it. This is baby on artificial lung patients per year, and bingo, you can see what happened. We've now knocked down the Ecmo in babies. There's some babies without pulmonary vessels or with diaphragmatic hernias. They don't respond very well to NO. They don't have any vessels. So there will always be some need for Ecmo, but a lot less than because it was growing like amazing. And, of course, adults. And so I think we're near 50,000 patients a year now. About 85%, 90% are cardiac. There's a lot of screaming and yelling because this is so expensive. But, nevertheless, it's used a lot. This is Mallinckrodt-ish. And luckily now, their patent has been broken, and Airgas will also sell it. So I think about 1 million people have breathed NO since we did that first study in '89. It's really been amazing. It's only approved by the FDA as a selective pulmonary vasodilator for babies, and the companies that worked on it for 20 or 30 years only were interested in babies. But what about cardiac patients? What about the others? So they've just begun to study them. Unfortunately. So it will have other uses. They will be proven. But the problem is it's very hard to get people to randomize now. People say, I know it works. I don't want nitrogen. It's very hard. So anyway, good luck to them. So I got mad at the idea that they were charging people $14,000 per baby. And with NO, and I said, geez, there are easier ways to do it, I'm sure. And my wife says that I have to tell you I have a conflict of interest because the patents covering electric nitric oxide were licensed by MGH to Third Pole, a little company, which has never sold anything yet and won't for a couple of years. But whenever a university licenses a company, the university, by the Bayh-Dole Act, has to get some royalties. And I would then share in some of those royalties, and all my fellows, half my fellows would share in them because they're all on the patents, and I have no stock. I don't do stock. But if it's ever sold, the hospital will definitely get some money. This is a little 4-minute video, but it's kind of... We gave a blue baby
nitric oxide to breathe, and the baby turned pink. I remember the nurse saying, "What did you do to the baby?" I said, "Well, we gave it a small amount of a poisonous gas, and it seems to have been helpful." Nitric oxide just worked because the gas opened the lung vessels up. So we knew we had the grail, something we'd sought all these years. For these babies, this is a life-saving gas.
Dear Dr. Zapp, hi. I just wanted to thank you and all those other people who do experiments and stuff. I was very sick when I was born, and that no stuff helped me get better. This letter was 17 years ago. That discovery is why I'm still here.
The next morning after he was born, we could see people scurrying around and starting
Father
IV
is an
drips.
anesthesiologist.
His blood pressure stabilized, his oxygen was extremely low, and
We were concerned that he wouldn't make it.
but then the neonatologist came back to us and said, "We had this gas on study. It had such dramatic results that we took it off the study early."
He said, "Your child is the first person who's going to get nitric oxide." It's like, wow, that's amazing.
It was very much a miracle that we could bring him home right from the ICU, normal, healthy, and we're grateful.
So this is the standard of delivery of cylinder gas. Only very wealthy countries that can afford a lot of trucks and cylinders are doing this. What about the rest of the world? What about the rest of the world? I remember in the early 90s that NASA had flown an airplane through a lightning bolt, and they had measured a lot of nitric oxide in the pathway of the lightning bolt. And I said, aha, lightning bolts make nitric oxide. Why don't we just make our nitric oxide from a little lightning bolt? This is a very simple inspiratory synthesis of nitric oxide machine. There is a spark generator in here, which is a little tiny sparker. Each spark combines the nitrogen and oxygen in the air and makes nitric oxide.
The electric nitric oxide generated from air with the device we build in the lab, we obtain the same results of gas tank that we usually use in the hospital.
In Uganda, if a child falls ill due to respiratory distress, and there's by far no ability to provide them with nitric oxide. And if we could make available to those children inhaled nitric oxide at the bedside, there's a real potential to reduce mortality by 20%.
There aren't very many medical stories where you take a sick unto death baby and convert them into a happy, healthy, normal baby that can go home and be like brothers and sisters. That's kind of hard to beat.
So Electric NO is going. I mean, the little company, which my son has shepherded, David, is now about 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, and is making the baby box and an adult box. And it's relatively simple, and it's going to be economical, and it could feasibly go around the world. But we published this in Science Translational Medicine, Ming Lan Yu, and you can see you can spark more often and make more. You can be stable. This is for 10 days, but we've made it works for about a month. You just have to change the scavenger and the filter occasionally. And that's my son and I, and that's the size of the box that he's holding there. It's pretty neat. So that's the tank, and that's the box, and we hope it will become economical and go to the rest of the world. I also tried a small portable box to use in pulmonary hypertension patients, and these patients are on. There's 6 of them here with various diagnoses: scleroderma, IPH, sarcoid, and they're on sildenafil, prednisone. Look at it, furosemide, albuterol. These people are on stacks of pulmonary vasodilators, but we gave them NO, either cylinder, continuous, or intermittent electric. And you can see the pressures go down, and you can't tell cylinder gas from electric, continuous, or intermittent. The PA pressures all go down on the right. And NO makes your lungs smarter, because the places that get the NO say, oh, let me increase flow here. I'm being ventilated. So these patients all were on oxygen of various sorts, and you could see their SpO2s all went up, breathing NO. So it makes your lungs smarter, it improves VQ matching, and it lowers the PA pressure. And my dream, which I'm still working on, is just to make it portable. It'll be iPhone size someday, or double iPhone sized. It's only a matter of time. But as usual, it takes the world about 30 years to go where I'm going, but it will get there. And the other thing we've just built is a mini generator. What do you need a big one for? This thing just weighs 14 grams, 3 pennies. And we just imagine it on the babies are all 2-3 kilograms. What do you need a big thing for? You could just put this right next to their endotracheal tube, as you see there on the right, and you could have a mini generator. And we use special electrodes, and we cool them with air pumped up across them. It works fine. We tested it in rabbits. Wanted something about the same weight as a baby. Works fine. So 29 years later, we know NO works, but there's none in India, none in China, none in Africa, none in, unfortunately, large stretches of the world, because by the time you get the tanks and the cylinders and the delivery devices, it's 15,000 a kid, or even when it's generic, it'll be 10,000 a kid. So it's still too much money. A lot of people can't afford $10,000 to save their baby, but they could afford enough to do an electric thing. I have 2 more slides, and then I'm done. One is my latest invention, which just came out in Science, Translational Medicine, October 9th. What is it? Well, in 1896, J.B.S. Haldane, a very famous English physiologist, said, visible light dissociates carbon monoxide from hemoglobin. And we still have a problem with firemen and soldiers who breathe carbon monoxide and get poisoned, but also get lung injury. So your oxygen or HBO don't work. And so what we decided to do, being an Ecmoist, is use LEDs that put out red light. We worked on all the wavelengths and patented this. This red is perfect. And so 1 photon will knock off 1 CO off 1 hemoglobin. Boink. And it doesn't take oxygen off. Isn't that cool? It's like, it is just so efficient. So read Science Translational Medicine, and we've done it in rats, and now I'm doing it in sheep with Anna Fischbach and Lucas Azaron and the people in my lab. So that's kind of cool. I have no doubt that EMTs, just as you see defibrillators around, you're going to see little boxes like this that you could do VV perfusion on. You only have 5-6 quarts of blood in you. I just have to clean your blood out, drain it, pass it through my Ecmo machine, hit it with red light, and take the CO away. It'll work, believe me. Invest. And then I have to show this picture. Those of you who were noticing the news 2 days ago, there were 2 women who spacewalked. This woman worked in my lab for 3 years. Her name is Jessica Meir. And Jessica is brilliant and was interested in Weddell seals. And we had a Weddell seal grant we were cooking. She came up to me one day and said, Dr. Zapol, I'm going to apply for the astronaut corps. But don't worry, there's 6,000 applicants for every woman who or man who gets selected. And I don't think I'll get selected. Wrong. Wrong. She's now spent 6 years in the astronaut corps, and it was just, she did a spacewalk 2 days ago, 7 hours plus. She's incredible. Courageous, smart physiologist working in an anesthesia department for 3 years. Let me tell you, you work in anesthesia, you could do anything. Let me end it there. Thanks, Susan, again. The Wood Library. I think she'll be the first woman on the moon, too. That's my hope.
Thank you, Warren. We will present you with a certificate.
Thank you.
2019 Lewis H. Wright Memorial Lecture.
Wait. Here, open. Face that camera.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bill, do we have time for questions or not?
We do. Time for some questions.
There are questions from the audience? Thank you. Thank you very much, Warren. That was wonderful. Wonderful. All right. There's Doug Bacon. Yes, Doug?
We have one more item this morning, and that's the announcement of the WLM Laureate of the History of Anesthesia. And to make this announcement is the chair of the WLM 2020 Laureate Committee, and indeed recipient of the 2012 Laureate, Dr. Doug Bacon.
First, I'd like to thank Dr. Zapol for an absolutely fascinating lecture, and that was just quite wonderful. As they say in Hollywood, since I don't know who the laureate is either, may I have the magic envelope, please? And since I've also grown old enough to probably not be able to read this without these, the 2020 WLM Laureate of the History of Anesthesia is also someone who has won the Order of Australia, Christine M. Ball. Congratulations, Dr. Ball.
Thanks very much for joining us today. Congratulations, Dr. Ball. Thanks, Dr. Zapol. Congratulations, Dr. Baus. It's been a great morning. I'm glad you're all here to join us for this. We are concluding for this session and look forward to seeing you at other history sessions coming up this year and next.